Hi, everybody, and welcome to a new Kerberos Media Chat. I'm your host, Joe Firestone. My guest for today, Don DeBar, and he is senior producer, and journalist and radio host of Community Public Radio of Ossining, New York.
Yep.
Okay.
Home of Sing Sing.
No.
I'm not in there, though. Not yet.
Okay, thank you, Don. And I seem to detect a New York accent. You from New York?
Yeah, I'm from Ossining, actually. My father is a graduate of Ossining High School in 1950, and I in 1972. I've lived around some, but I'm a New York boy, yeah.
Okay, well, I'm from New York State as well. I'm actually from New York City. I'm actually from the Bronx originally.
The Bronx. I know it well.
The Bronx, yeah.
Bronx, yes.
The Bronx. I'm a proud Bronxite, but I live in Ashburn, Virginia these days because my grandchildren are here. Good. That's about 30 miles west of Washington, D.C.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know it.
Yeah. So, folks, in spite of our cheerfulness and cordiality, our topic for today is going to be World War III. So I hope you're interested in that. We are very interested in that, and that's why we are doing it. So, Don, what about World War III?
I would say, first of all, it may be news to some people, maybe to many people, but we're already engaged in it, and that's been admitted by a variety of members of Congress, both houses, some folks at the Pentagon, folks in the White House, including the president, although he retracted it several times, and certainly in the minds of Russian strategic planners. When you look at the fact that the United States proposes and is in the midst of spending more money on military force in Ukraine fighting Russia than Russia spent last year on its own military for the whole year. I think we're at war with Russia. And, of course, World War III, in our lexicon, has always meant a war between the United States and Russia.
Unfortunately so. We are just approving a $40 billion appropriation to go to Ukraine, on top of $13.6 billion that we already spent. So we're looking at $53.6 billion to do what we've sometimes called a proxy war, in Ukraine.
Right.
Now, increasingly, it seems to be getting less and less proxy.
Yeah.
And more direct.
It's going to get less proxy still. And also, those figures, you're talking the $13.6 billion already spent, another $40 billion that's only going through some formalities before it's approved Monday or Tuesday. That's only for 5 months, and for a total of 7 months. What we're talking about annualized, if you're talking about roughly $60 billion for 7 months, you're talking somewhere in the neighborhood of 85 to $90 billion annualized. Russia's military budget for the entire year, which includes not just the defense of its western borders with East Europe and Southwest Asia, but also the Pacific, Japanese defense, military, for example, the South Korean military, U.S. bases in the Philippines, and all of that. That $65 billion includes fighting a war, in essence, in the East also, which, if you take a look at what's been developing there, one thing, for example, another amendment to the Japanese Constitution, the Japanese Constitution that was written in 1945 forbade Japan from having a military, from having an army.
Yes,
that was modified to allow a self-defense force in the country. That was modified again in 2014, around the time of the coup in Ukraine, to allow them to actually fight something other than a strictly defensive war if Japan's self-defense was somewhere on the horizon of this adventure. And now they're pulling all the stops off, and they're even allowed to go in and ally themselves in a war that has nothing to do with Japan's self-defense. And so
the Russians have to worry about a threat.
Yeah,
in
no, they
Asia
fought a war against Japan and
as
they fought
well.
a war against Germany at the same time. So did we, but it was on their borders.
Yes, yes, of course. So, what do you make of how we got into this in the first place? It's
Well,
actually a very long story, isn't
yeah, well, the short version is that ever since the Russian Revolution in 1917, the United States and the European, at the time, the European colonial powers, and really, you use this terminology of nation states to discuss international relations and particularly war making, but it serves the interests of a very small group of people. The U.S. is at war with Russia right now. Again, a host of government officials have said that, and so has Russia. They noticed it. But there hasn't
it?
been a referendum. There hasn't even been a vote on whether or not this would happen. As a matter of fact, the only allusion to this during the last election was that Trump said that this is what would happen if they elected Biden. Biden denied, vehemently, as did every other Democrat up and down the aisle, that they intended war with Russia at all. And the moment that Biden took office and that was secured, policy changed and became much more aggressive. So since 1917, that's been the policy of the United States. It's essentially to decapitate the Russian state, to provide access to the U.S. and at various times European colonial and wannabe colonial powers, Germany being in the latter category there. Read Mein Kampf, for example. Hitler lays that out pretty clearly. And also to, the Russian labor force is highly educated, highly skilled in, post-industrial, skills, and basically to appropriate these things and have them owned by the elite that owns pretty much everything else, including us. So that is the most expensive project in the history of humanity, capturing Russia. The U.S. military budgets that have, in the trillions of now in the tens of trillions of dollars in the last post-war period, 1945 to now, 77 years, all geared towards first taking down the Soviet state, which was successful in 1991, and now to decapitate the Russian state, which they have openly said now. Even Biden said it again. They retracted it twice. Openly said regime change in Russia is what we want. We will not be finished with this little adventure until we have it. The problem being that Russia has said there will be no regime change here, and we have these weapons that are unimaginable that we know how to use, that we will use to prevent that from happening. And we're kind
right.
of
And my understanding is
cauldron.
They are more advanced, than our weapons right now.
I mean,
the hypersonic missiles, for example.
We're seeing a dress rehearsal right now, with Ukraine as the testing grounds, the proving grounds. But yeah, they have demonstrated hypersonic technology, and their missiles have always been more accurate than the American ones. One of the reasons that they were in space before us was that our stuff kept blowing up on the launch pad, and their stuff kept going up in the air. And they've had that kind of an advantage. I don't know what it is, but that has been true. In terms of weaponry and in terms of their military, their entire purpose, the nature of this two societies, really, if anyone wants to take an honest look, Russia's entire military construct betrays its mission, which is self-defense. It's not for projecting power to the Long Island Sound or the Gulf of California or the Gulf of Mexico. It's for defending the Russian homeland. And that's why their budget is $65 billion. And they rely not so much on, things intended to acquire and occupy territory, but rather to repel invaders. And so it's high tech on the one hand, very heavy artillery on the other to blow up people that approach the borders. That's what we're seeing now. And the U.S. is obvious also. Number one, the 800 military bases that are stationed around the world. These are next nodes of occupation.
Yes,
military
there
occupation.
are. And just to compare the figures a little bit, they spend $65 billion, and our budget is
More than
$780 billion, and that doesn't count what Homeland Security spends
or
and from
CIA.
other aspects, okay, or CIA, right, or some of the others. So
Yep.
really, the U.S., we're talking about $1 trillion each year.
And with that, okay, now we're talking like 15 years ago now, or a little more. When the budgets were, only $500 or $600 billion, Cynthia McKinney is grilling Rumsfeld, who was the defense secretary at the time. Where's the missing $2 trillion? In other words, they're being given everything you say, and apparently they also clipped 2 or 3 times the annual budget somewhere within a period of a couple of years. So that got noticed. So it's all way more than we spend more in a month, or in any event, we pay more in a month. We taxpayers in the United States more in a month than Russia spends in a year on its military. So to call Russia a military aggressor and the United States the guardian of freedom, it's absurd. It doesn't even strain.
Well, we already know that we're not the guardian of freedom,
Right.
because I don't know if we can even
Or worse.
indicate one place on Earth where we are guarding freedom right now.
Not even here, especially here.
Right, especially here, but also not in Ukraine.
Yeah,
which is far from a democracy.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's just myth. It's myth. It is all myth.
So meanwhile, you have, it's kind of remarkable too. Some other things about the nature of the state in the West. A little history, first of all. People know this, but they don't really use it to frame their view of reality, because the reality is that Europe was built on colonialism: Spanish colonialism, British colonialism, French colonialism, Italian colonialism, Dutch colonialism. Around the world, there are, totaling billions of casualties from the first acquisition and then maintenance of these various empires. The British Empire that the sun never set on, because the territories were flung around the world pretty much in every time zone. The French had colonies from Indochina to the Caribbean, all over Africa, North and West Africa. And Spanish, most of America, including the United States, up until the beginning of the 20th century, or the end of the 19th century, 1898. The Dutch, they had plenty of colonies too, and the Belgians also, including the Congo, one of the most brutal colonial powers in the world. Portugal also, little Portugal. Brazil was a Portuguese colony. And others, Angola, for example, in Africa. This is the wealth and the industrial base of Europe is based upon genocide, slavery, and theft. And that has been the modality since they decided to go abroad to do that, rather than doing it, or while they do it to each other, which has been another problem. You have not seen the centuries of war in Africa or Central and South America or North America before the Europeans got here, or in most of Asia, that you saw from the period perhaps 500 years before the founding of the Roman Republic up until last Tuesday. These are the people that are civilizing the world, that are lecturing people on democracy, rule of law, morality, Christianity, and whatever else you want to toy with, against the Russians that they're now, trying to turn into public relations barbarians. That, well, we can't have Russian ballet. They don't do ballet. They have club. It's the whole show is absurd. But that the material basis is this has been always a construct of domination, global domination, and domestic domination. And it's reproducing. In the United States, if you look at the ownership of real estate, for example, they are well along the way to reproducing feudal real property relations, with large corporations standing in the place of where the nobility did before, which really is only a difference in form, because those corporations are owned by someone.
The billionaires also.
Only these people,
set
some of these,
themselves up. Okay, the
yeah, some of
billionaires also
these
set
entities,
themselves up.
yeah,
Not in terms of their corporations, even, but in terms of the way that they deal with other people. They're at the center, and then they have people who are basically vassals,
yeah,
and they pay the vassals off
yeah,
fairly well. Someone like George Soros, let's say,
yeah, whatever.
right, or whatever. But they
The
put themselves
administrators,
okay at the center,
yeah,
and they basically set up an informal kind of a feudal organization. And the different of the billionaire feudal organizations under the surface, not covered by the news media, are basically fighting each other. They continue to do that. And what that Twitter purchase is about.
yeah, that's cute watching that.
Yeah.
Trump's presidency was an indication of that too.
Yes, it was.
You saw this play out in Germany and other parts of Europe at the end of the 1980s and beginning of 1990s also. At the time that the reunification of Germany was being actualized, for example, the German and European elites had, they were of two minds about what was going to follow. The industrial elite in Germany, for example, is looking eastward. My God, we're going to be fabulously well-to-do. We're going to redevelop Russia. And there's, all those resources and, 250 million people in the various republics. And we're going to, build like 50 years worth of new infrastructure there. We're going to get rich. And finance said, no, you're not. No, you're not. We're going to pauperize those people. We're going to level it, and we're going to take ownership of the resources. And they actually killed one of the main central bankers in Germany over this feud because he was insistent on financing eastward expansion of German industry. They have a model that they want to stick to. There's some dissent over it. I once I went to a meeting in D.C. Back in like 2017, early 2018. It was a little after Trump took office, and it was supposed to be a presentation by Corey Lewandowski, and it was, but there were two parts in the presentation. First was the guy that Trump had just appointed to the Export-Import Bank, the head of that, and it was like his first week or something. And so I said to him, he wanted to people there, spitball some things and see, what do you think about this, that, and the other? So I said, well, the thing that occurs to me is that we're looking at a planet where, 10 to 40% of the people are lacking one or more of the following: housing, water supply, septic, sewage, whatever, electrical grid, communications infrastructure, schools, hospitals, roads, ports, rail, roadways, all of that. And for some reason, China is able to drop into these places that have no money, supposedly, but they have other resources, and build a city from scratch that's self-financing, that doesn't leave the people in a debt trap. And they have built a tremendous capacity to do this, and they're walking around the world offering to do it. And we, who have the same industrial capacity, the same material wherewithal, instead have millions of people with these skills unemployed or working at Walmart or Burger King or whatever, and rusting on the lot out there, all kinds of heavy equipment that could be building this stuff. And for some reason, we can't either A, partner with them and do this stuff, or B, compete with them and do this stuff. And it seems to me that the only problem is one of accounting, that there are some people here whose pockets do not get enlarged by this thing that needs to be done being done, and they're in a position to prevent it from being done. And they don't have that problem in China, or the ascendant part of the elite is able to increase their power by doing it. But it tells us what our task is, which is to find the people that are preventing the economy from being used productively and for the benefit of people, and do whatever you have to do to remove them from that position. The Romanovs are one example of what to do. But what China showed what to do with landlords in 1949, that's another model. I'm not advocating it, but I'm reporting the history. That's what was done. And sure enough, stayed done for a long time after they did it, too.
Yes, it did.
Yeah.
Okay, it really did. Okay, so we're in the middle of World War III now, or it's just sort of starting up in World War III. What is the likely course of World War III going to be?
Course?
The course.
They're very limited.
In other words, let's start, with Ukraine,
Yeah.
itself.
Okay.
How is Ukraine going to be resolved at this point?
Well, okay. I mean, the possibilities are either that it will be resolved before, there's a larger war, or there will be a larger war. We don't know. Both are very possible. It seems to me that the people who are making policy here do not want it to be resolved. The point of it, they have said so out loud, is to try to degrade Russia's military, to implode Russia's economy, and to induce a regime change in Russia as a consequence of this.
Yes, they seem to be our foreign policy goals. Yes. So we don't want a short war.
Right. So Russia's objective there, they were clear about it years before this happened. And even people here like Stephen Cohen and others, and even people more inside than that, have been saying for many years, certainly since 1991, perhaps even since 1988, 89, when the discussions were taking place literally about the Soviet Union being the only one of the four powers to end its occupation of Germany.
Yes.
That's what happened. The reunification of Germany was the four powers that occupied it, Britain, France, the United States, and the Soviet Union, had partitioned Germany into four pieces. Exactly. They partitioned Berlin into four pieces that was inside the Soviet zone. Against the agreement that was made in 1945 and 44, the three Western zones were merged into a German state that became the Federal Republic of Germany. That was actually a violation of the agreement. That wasn't supposed to happen. And then there were the various incidents there that we almost, they're flashpoints for World War III before. After many years of overt hostilities, the Cold War and all of that, there was an agreement to allow German state to be fully reunified, and the method was for the Soviets to abandon their occupation of Germany and to allow the state that was consisting of the continuing occupation of the United States and to a lesser degree the UK and France to swallow the whole. The agreement there was, and the Soviets had said, well, first of all, just to understand the fairness of that, Germany invaded the Soviet Union.
Yes.
And it occupied part of the Soviet Union, and it killed somewhere between 25 and 30 million people in the Soviet Union.
Yes.
Okay. The United States lost in the two wars, Germany and Japan, six figures worth of casualties in terms of killed, and most of those, almost all of them, soldiers. Britain lost also on that order. They were bombed with V1s and a few V2s for a while, but the mainland was really not bothered. This was a fight over Britain's colonies, not over Britain. France, on the one hand, it was occupied. It was kind of occupied, though, the way like your girlfriend occupies your house when she stops in for a visit after you invite her, because there was a very strong fascistic tendency inside France that welcomed Hitler and that also was not pleased with the post-World War I order of things, wanted to reclaim some French colonies and French prestige, and didn't mind seeing Germany ascend over Britain and the United States. And so, when the opportunity presented itself to thwart Hitler by making agreements with the Soviet Union, as Stalin advocated starting in 1933, between Britain and the Soviet Union and France and the Soviet Union, and by the way, the US and the Soviet Union, to show Hitler that if you invade any one of us, you're automatically in a two-front war. They all declined the Soviet Union and started tearing it up pretty much. Then suddenly this agreement came. And so anyway, that's the climate that sets the stage for the partition of Germany. Germany is reunited. The Soviet Union says, as long as you guys stay on that side of the Elbe,
we're okay.
We don't care even about these buffer states between us, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Bulgaria. They're all complaining so much about being dominated by us, quote unquote. We've been subsidizing them for years they can go their own way. Just don't bring your military there, because the reason we were there is so we don't have Germany rolling through here again. We're tired of France and Germany invading.
Yes.
The U.S. said fine, starting in 88 when they were having the conversations. And on the record, there were agreements and understandings that this would be the case. And it was like that for a couple of years. And then when Clinton took office, they started acquiring European countries as members of NATO.
They started
deploying the military there. Now, at the time that this was happening, Yeltsin was the president of Russia, and mostly, if it didn't happen in the bar that he was in or on the TV in the bar, he didn't know what was going on. When he handed over power to Vladimir Putin and the group that was around him, which also people don't factor, but there's a government, and it's not Putin. There's an actual government in Russia. The U.S. should maybe study it and see how it's done. They decided that, hey, look, these guys are coming for us, and we need to start at least talking about it. And by 2007, when the U.S. had now acquired all the way up to the Russian border and was fooling around in some of the old the Soviet republics, Georgia in particular at that time, and they had already been fooling around in Ukraine in 2004, that the Russian government said, look, you have to back up. We see what you're doing, okay? You're coming here. We're not going to let you do it. We have the weaponry to protect ourselves. We don't want a war, but if you come in here, you're going to get one. And the U.S. has just been managing to, creep closer and closer. They took in the 3 Baltic republics.
Yes.
Which were also fascist allies in World War II, by the way.
Right. And they pointed missiles
at
Russia.
By the way, over on the other side, they're installing THAAD missiles in what they call South Korea, Republic of Korea, occupied Korea, that is. That's the part, just for a little history lesson on that. The Japanese, starting in the late 20s, tried to take Korea as a colony. They got about to the 38th parallel, and they enslaved the women that lived in what we now call South Korea. They murdered most of the men or enslaved them or impressed them into the military, and they occupied it straight through the end of the war. What happened when the U.S. accepted the unconditional surrender, as it demanded, of Japan's military, was that Japan's military continued the occupation of Korea, except that they now reported to American commanders. And then those people were slowly turfed out until the Americans took over the Japanese occupation, which remains today. So that part of Korea, occupied Korea, the U.S. started deploying THAAD missile systems, their anti-missiles. At the same time, they were doing it in Bulgaria and Romania. In other words, what the U.S. had done, now that they were deploying military force and nuclear weapons at Russia's borders, they were also setting up anti-missiles so that a U.S. first strike could happen and then the reply strike be shot down over Russia. They were installing the architecture for this and installed a good deal of it. Then last year, after the coup in Ukraine, after they installed Nazis, Nazis killed 25 to 30 million people in the Soviet Union 77 years ago. And in fact, since this is 8 years ago, that was 69 years prior. That people there, my parents were killed, my grandparents were killed, in that war, et cetera. It's still very present in their, in their political culture. They don't send in, guys wearing Bozo the Clown suits or, whatever, Arnold Schwarzenegger, whatever. They send in Nazis. Maybe that's a little redundant. And they send in Nazis, and it scares the hell out of the Russian populace, particularly the Russians that live in East Ukraine, who, they're watching TV and realizing that the president just commanded the military to go kill them and don't speak your language in the schools anymore, et cetera. You can't get away with that in New York City, trying to tell people you can't speak Spanish in school anymore, or Chinese, or, Hebrew or whatever. But they saw what was coming. And then last year, this is where I was getting to, they tried a coup in Belarus, which might as well be right inside Russia because it's been part of Russia forever, and Kazakhstan. And if you look at a map with the Baltic republics and with Ukraine, even up to the Dnieper River, the middle of Ukraine, with Kazakhstan and Belarus, if you put them all in on one side in NATO, and then look at the invasion in 1941, Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union, NATO is placed deeper than Hitler ever got. So they saw that, their military strategists saw this a long time ago. Russia had to reindustrialize, and they did some weapons development, and they reorganized their government and their military. And I'm sure that the senior leadership did what Stalin did back in the late 30s, early 40s, which was to take a really deep, close look at the officer class and make sure that the guys that were up in the Kremlin defending the president weren't going to shoot him in the back of the head, a la Allende or something. So, so here we are. They said we're not going to allow this to continue. They offered in this past December an agreement to we'll pull our own military back from our own borders if you pull your militaries back to where you promised to keep them, 20 years ago. And the United States said no.
Yeah, it's important also to tell people to realize that Putin was pushing back against this pretty much from the time he got into office, beginning, let's say, in 2000 or so.
Yeah, that's about right.
He kept objecting. He kept saying, you're breaking the deal.
Yeah.
Do not do this. It's not going to end well. After years and years and years, of warning, then we support the coup in 2014 and 2015 and install a U.S. puppet in there. And then the government of Ukraine starts shelling its own citizens using troops that incorporated the Nazis, and was making Nazis part of the official army of Ukraine, sending them to Donbass and starting daily artillery shelling of Donbass, resulting in 14 to 15,000 casualties.
That's right.
Up to the start of what we view as the war. In other words, up to this February 24th.
Right. That's about right. Yep.
That's what was going on there. Now, there were some Russian operatives inside of the Donbass too, but no official Russian army was there. There was no Russian army there. There was no invasion by Russia.
Yep.
There was only support of the civilian Russian-speaking population inside, of Donbass.
Hey, let me ask you a question. Okay, as much as it was portrayed as the Russians were fighting the Ukrainians and seizing Ukrainian territory and all of that, and that the hand of Russia in East Ukraine from 2014 until February 23rd of this year, whatever, on the one hand, and the hand of the United States in Ukraine right now with $56 billion worth of investment, plus the $5 billion that Newland said that we spent setting up communications infrastructure or whatever before the coup, the actual conduct of the coup, the actual operation and training of the government officials and the networking where these ultra-nationalists who want to get rid of the Russian influence can't find governors that are Ukrainian, so they hire Saakashvili and other foreigners to their nationalist government. The hand of Russia in that fighting, which was some advisors and people, by the way, with relatives in Donbass, because those people are not used to there being the border between Russia and Ukraine up until very recently was like the border between New Jersey and Delaware. There was, there's a toll booth, hang on, who's got a couple kopecks? And so the families lived, all over the place. Mom lives in Moscow. I live in Donetsk. My brother lives in, wherever. And now it's different. But, we have more advisors there than Russia had before, obviously. And we, in terms of hardware, how much hardware can you buy with $14 billion? The other thing, we're talking about these numbers here. 40 billion and 13.6 billion from the United States. Germany's also funding it. The UK is also funding it. France is also funding it. Italy is also. That's on top of that.
Yeah. Why do you think the European nations are standing for it? There's been no real threat from Russia for a long time. The defensive purpose of NATO, is gone. So what is their incentive to fall in line behind the United States, disrupt their own economies, create supply chain problems, inflation problems, lose much of their energy supplies? Why are they doing it? What is this about?
You said before why. You used the V word, vassal. This is an empire. These are the local administrators of the empire. They're paid very well. They're very privileged relative to the people that live in, the other people that live in their occupied countries. They manage the local constabulary. They manage the local military. They manage the local economy. They're allowed to put their, thumb in the pie and lick off some of the blueberry once in a while. And they get to be hot stuff. They're on TV. That's basically it. It pays well compared to everybody else, but it doesn't pay well enough because the people on the top, they're very hungry. They don't want to just wet their beak. They want to immerse their skulls. And so they're paid to do what they're doing.
Maybe, but it doesn't explain it for me, because the Europeans have had generally prosperous situations, in their society until, let's say 2009, 2010.
Right.
And, then there was also considerable recovery since then. It just doesn't make any logical sense to me that they would just fall in line. Did they really expect to remain vassals of the United States forever?
There's been an ongoing, there's a number of things that have been sort of stitching together to constitute this particular cloth. First of all, there's been ongoing since now, like the time of Maggie Thatcher and even before that, but certainly Thatcher, Carter, and Reagan, even Gerald Ford, a pauperization of the working class and the middle classes, a concentration of wealth way out of whack with what they've had, for
certainly here.
Yeah, here and in Europe. That same game has been played out there. And you've had what is in essence a parallel to the political condition that exists here, where you don't even have liberals now. You have neoliberals who are, unanimously voting for war with Russia in the House and Senate. Neoliberals, quote unquote, call themselves liberals, and even leftists among the constituency that are lining right up behind them. The landscape in Europe is very similar. Those that are objecting, first of all, left and right, the terms have been so bastardized and so denuded, so neutered, that they're meaningless for all except really the high level intellectual conversation. People that are familiar with the French Revolution and Marx and whoever else. The average person thinks that the Democratic Party is left and the Republican Party is right. And so in Europe, the same. I was in Paris 3 years ago this month and marched with the yellow vests there. Here, people, and even in France, they're ridiculed as a movement of the right wing, of the ultra right. They're white supremacists, even though about a third of the folks there were people of color. They're reactionary. They're sort of frustrated petty bourgeois, blah blah blah, all of that stuff. But in fact, they weren't. These are people who were worried about war and peace, about jobs, about the social safety net, about housing, all of this stuff, and they're not being heard in the institutions, just like they're not being heard here. In the
so they go out and protest.
They're out in the streets and they're organizing. We sat in an organizing session in one of the parks there with about 80 people sitting there working on what they're going to do the next week. We had Occupy Wall Street here for whatever value the thing itself had, and whatever the initiated that particular set of actions, the soil in which it took place and the way that it spread across the planet shows that that soil is very fertile for some sort of a popular, revolutionary movement.
Yes.
And the basis of that is that the conditions are such that people recognize, first of all, they know that they have grievances. It's one thing to show people pictures of filet mignon and lobster on television and tell them that they're being well fed. And if they're eating anything at all, you might convince them of that. It's another thing when they haven't eaten in several days, or they're deciding whether to feed their kid or get health care for their parents who are sick. That stuff tends to bring them back to reality no matter what's on television. And we're at a stage where that's true. If you look at Sanders and Trump as a phenomenon in 2016, which was the last presidential election we had that wasn't under a state of emergency, because you got to consider 2020 was a different animal. Both of these outsiders, no matter what the intentions again were of either them or the people that put them there, to the population, these were the ones we're not supposed to vote for. So that's who we're voting for.
Yes.
We're rejecting the system. And at the time that happened, you had a whole lot of other people out in the street over Black Lives Matter. In 2016, you had three distinct working class movements that could be visibly observed, even though the TV was telling you something else was going on. And this is a condition that the elite recognizes exists throughout Europe and the United States and westernized Asia. And so they have a very serious concern over this. And the elites themselves, I don't know what's going on with the actual elite. We don't know their names and addresses. We don't know who they really are. But we do know who sits at the levers of power, political power and economic power, at least visibly. And those people have jobs that are really hard to replace. And they know that when people start wheeling a guillotine down the street or whatever, that we do have their names and addresses and that their situation is shaky. And so they are playing on the team. If the United States says to keep your job, this is what you have to do, they're like, yes, sir. Yes, sir. And that, I think, is what more. Look at Angela Merkel. She finds out that Obama taps her phone. So, she pitches a fit for a minute in the media, and it's back to business as usual. Look at when that happened, it was her. It was Dilma Rousseff, okay, also. Dilma Rousseff did not go quietly into that good night, though, so they sent her into that good night. She ended up pushed out of power in favor of the guy who was polling at 2%.
Yes, I remember.
So when they flex their muscles, look, Saddam Hussein was their boy. He stepped off the ranch. Even Muammar Gaddafi wasn't, but he did play ball with them for a minute, for the benefit of his country. I would say that. And they chased him with jet planes and stuff. They, when they're mad at you, watch out. And these people all know that better than anyone. So that's, I think, the motivation is fear and greed at a personal level.
Yeah, the fear part of it accounts for a lot. Okay, getting back to Ukraine. Okay, let us say, I think this is a reasonable scenario, that pretty soon the cauldron is going to be closed.
Yeah.
And those 80,000 troops, are going to be out of it. I don't know whether it'll be next 2 weeks, next 6 weeks, next 8 weeks.
Yeah, whatever. Yeah, right.
But I don't think it's going to be too long from now because they've been working at it for some time now.
I agree.
And I don't think the troops, are able to get out of there. There's talk of a counterattack, but, that's coming from the BS media.
Right.
And I'm sure it's greatly exaggerated.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's say the Russians do close the trap and they do make it very, very difficult for Ukraine to continue a resistance because those 80,000 troops, are gone.
Right.
So Zelensky then has to come to the table, right? And he has to negotiate with Putin. So, how does the United States react to that? In other words, what is NATO's move to counter that?
Right. Well, all right. So, a couple of things that'll happen. Right. First of all, context for Zelensky. This is part of it is deduction. They had a negotiator that was going to the meetings with the Russians, and there were announcements that they were getting close to a deal. And that negotiator was murdered. And just to drive home the point, he was murdered outside a courthouse, not like in his bed or walking through the park or whatever. Zelensky knows that the people he's been partnering with, to use Lavrov's term, they don't want a peaceful settlement. They want, as we said earlier, they want to engage long term, as long as they can do it, to degrade Russia. They have an illusion that they're going to recreate 91, that they're going to, and they misinterpret what happened in 1991 as well.
Yeah.
They think that the war in Afghanistan wore down the Soviet military's effectiveness, that it also created a political crisis inside the country analogous to what Vietnam did, Vietnam syndrome or whatever. Those two things caused a crisis in the leadership and a loss of legitimacy of the government and of the system in front of people there. And what they also did at that time, people aren't aware of that so much. The engagement of Nixon, Ford, and even Carter, to the extent that it lasted that long, détente, particularly the commercial engagement, included heavy lending by the IMF to the socialist bloc.
Yes.
That money was then used to purchase consumer goods from the West. The industrial base of Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union was pretty much destroyed in World War II, unlike the United States.
Yes.
And unlike Europe, the Soviet Union didn't have an intact ally to redevelop it. It had to do it by itself, and it had to redevelop the Warsaw Pact countries also, because they had to stabilize it, because that was a buffer between them and Germany. So while they were going through all of this, and the United States was redeveloping the other half of the global economy, there was this competition, and there was heavy propaganda from the West. Why are you guys building steel mills? Why aren't you building Jordache jean factories and Beatle albums and all this kind of stuff? They did make a serious imprint into the culture with these consumer goods. And so when the deal was cut for détente, they said basically, here, we're going to lend you the money to buy like Sony Walkmans and all this kind of stuff. And they did. And they got the population, they were addicted to it. And then Carter cut off the flow of money. And they did it also. So what happened? You had suddenly like a westernized segment of the population that now couldn't get these things anymore because of my own government. It created the fifth column inside each of these countries. And they had abandoned some of the industries, their own domestic industries, in favor of some of this. And so now you had not just mythical shortages like you had from Hollywood in the 50s, but actual shortages of an awful lot of basic consumer goods. And that ate the economy out from the bottom, because then what happened was, okay, if you can't get potatoes or beef at the supermarket, because those are some of the holes that are left in the economy, I'm the guy that drives the truck from the pork farm to the supermarket. But I know if instead, the other thing they did was they set up a parallel set of retail outlets called Berioska stores, where you could only buy Western consumer goods if you had a Western currency, a dollar, a pound, a mark, etc. at the time, before the euro.
So the ruble was no good in those stores.
You couldn't spend rubles in there. Sort of like they had in Cuba up until last year, 2 years ago, with you had the Cuban peso and then what they call cukes. It's a currency unit that foreigners used. And so what happened was, I'm the guy that drives the pork from the farm to the supermarket. Well, that pork falls off the truck. I'm over by a Western hotel selling it to those guys. I'm getting dollars. I'm going to buy my daughter a Walkman. And you had this going on throughout the economy, exacerbating the problems that were induced originally. So while you had a political crisis, while you had a domestic political crisis that was a consequence of that, and then while you start eating out the economy, that's when all this other stuff happened. And they had already recruited among the intelligence agencies and the military and among the top pinnacle of the socialist economy. Because you notice that what happened when the Soviet Union fell was that the people who were the ministers, say, of the National Oil Company suddenly became the owners of the National Oil Company. So when, some billionaire in Europe and a billionaire in the United States is saying, look, later for the Soviet Union nonsense, if you help us, you're going to be one of the richest guys in the world. Yeah, it's going to be an oppressive system, but you're going to be sitting on top of it. And you had that from various sectors there. Some of them got eaten up. Like the guy that thought he was going to be selling Moskviches or Ladas in the United States or Trabants. They end up, I don't know, whatever, pimping in Paris or whatever. But the ones on the oil companies and other places did very well. Now, some of those, they call them oligarchs. If those are oligarchs, I don't know what the ones we got are called. But some of that, as soon as Putin came in, undid that. Like Rosneft and different gas and oil and other, valuable assets were retaken by the government from the creeps that stole it. And so this is all playing in the background, and it's all factors in 1991. They think they can induce that again. That you've got all the weaponry going in there. You've had all this PR about Putin's got cancer. Gee, we really think it would be much easier on the Ukrainian and the Russian people if some generals would put an end to Putin's regime. We're going to drag this war out for as long as we can. Here's another $50 billion, and et cetera, et cetera. Except they're not going to do that. Russia is prepared for this war. They've said so, and they're going to bring it here. This world war is going to be truly a world war. It's not going to be fought there's going to be a lot of stuff that blows up here with people along with it. It's going to be more, the artwork to depict it. It's not going to be five guys putting a flag up on Guam or whatever. It's going to be Hiroshima shadows. And they're willing to do that. These people are making policy. There was an editorial in the Wall Street Journal on the 27th of April. I forget the full title of it, but the essence of it, it was, what's his name? Joseph, what's his name's son? An insider, a guy that was an advisor to Weinberger. He's hot stuff at the University of Chicago, as his father was, saying basically, in order to win the war in Ukraine, we have to let Russia know that we think a nuclear war is winnable. Materially let them know. Not like, BS them into thinking we might do it. Show them we're willing to do it. And if we have to, do it. Wall Street Journal. This isn't the National Enquirer. And this guy's not an outlier. This wasn't, one of the crazies on the internet or whatever. This is a policymaker from long-standing, the son of a father that was a policymaker of long-standing. He's an insider speaking in the Wall Street Journal from his base at the University of Chicago. That's establishment.
Yeah, he sounds like an internet crazy to me, however. So you think that this will not be allowed to be a short war, because if Zelensky should attempt to end it, he will. His throat will be cut by somebody.
He has good reason to believe that he'll be assassinated immediately after stepping out of line, and he has no personal, political base. He's a puppet. He works for Komoysky. He works for one of the so-called oligarchs.
Yes,
he's an actor. I mean, he was paid to play this role on TV before he started playing it on the internet.
Yes.
And to answer your question directly, the possible outcomes are either the U.S. succeeds in extending the war, or it doesn't. if it doesn't succeed, it's either because peace was made or because the big war happens very soon and it doesn't, extend that far. That Russia says enough, or some other thing happens, or it gets extended. And if it gets extended, it either deteriorates into nuclear war, or something else happens. One thing that could happen is, that Russia collapses, a regime change there, or whatever. Another thing that happens,
Russia's not going to collapse.
I don't think that's going to happen, because they already said if we get there, we're going to start blowing some of your stuff up and see how that plays.
Right, but I think now it's too strong economically.
Yeah,
with they don't resistance of China.
Yeah, exactly.
It's and with the breakup of the dollar network.
All of
that. The fact that they're off dollars now. There's an alternative network that's being set up.
Yep.
The world is splitting into two financial subsystems that are distinct. That's a big loss for us.
Yeah, especially when you figure half of the global population is there, and maybe 2/3 of the manufacturing base. And that's the other thing. If we disengage, for example, economically with China, they keep the factories and they send home the lawyers, accountants, and PR people.
Yep.
So we'll have to eat them. That's what we'll have
do. And then we'll have to build our own factories, of course, again.
Yeah, if we can remember how.
If we can remember how, yes.
The other problem, so the other possibility, if you extend this war and there's not a catastrophic, immediately catastrophic conclusion to it, it continues to drain the economies of the United States and Europe. Now, Europe is, especially Western Europe, France, Germany in particular, and the UK, politically more volatile than the United States generally. There's a broader understanding of politics and a broader spectrum of political thought and ideology that's actually represented in the system. Pretty much all of that's lost its legitimacy for years now in the eyes of most of the people there. If you remember what happened in Greece not so long ago, and you could see in France and in Britain and in Germany that there, some real powder ready to fire. Well, now there's an intensification of the immiseration of the working class. Where people now are actually deciding whether to eat or freeze to death. And that's, in the spring. I'm going to say by December, January, that's going to be a much more critical situation. And people in Europe are accustomed to dislocation of a magnitude and style that the United States isn't. This is the same government that they put in power in like 1790. Okay, there have been revolutions and conquests and et cetera, changes of government throughout, exception of Great Britain. And so people there they don't consider the state and their particular republic as sacred in the same way that the U.S. does. And if you continue to immiserate the population there, which seems to be, a twin of this war, then you may see some very drastic changes on the ground. Who would have predicted even 6 months ago that Hungary would break with the EU to refuse to go to war with Russia? I mean, I remember 1956, and so does just about everybody in Hungary.
So do I.
Yeah, in the middle of this war, they're choosing up the other side. They're blocking a whole bunch of stuff from going on. Some of the crazy things. I mean, we might see an immediate flare up if there's not a retraction. I mean, we can see it this weekend or this coming week. If there's not a retraction of Finland's announcement.
I have one more scenario.
Yeah, go ahead.
To address. What happens if the Russians actually capture Zelensky?
Well, they'd have to conquer Poland because, in my view, he's been in Warsaw. Forget all this nonsense we've seen on television.
Oh, you think he's not even in Ukraine anymore?
He left Kiev. This much is a fact. He left Kiev on like the 25th of February with the U.S. Embassy and the NATO office that was in Kiev. They went to Lvov, however you want to pronounce it, depending on which side you're on. for that weekend. And that Monday, they were trying to put together the first parlay, peace talks with Russia. Yeah. Russia said, let's meet in this Ukrainian city that was just over the border of Belarus, because they figured they could send a delegation through Belarus safely, and they just have to provide for security when they get in there. And this was sort of not the heart of Ukraine, so they could protect it. He said, no, I want to meet in Warsaw. Oh. He insisted. So they held it at this other location, and he didn't attend. Now, the only visual stuff that I've seen, I've been combing the, YouTube and foreign media for it, of him in Kiev is either indoors, a lot of it was just like a flag behind him or whatever, or outdoors. One of them had artifacts that you have, like when you do a background thing on one of these, when you do what they call a matte, superimposition of a figure over a generated background. One of the things that they presented early had that. Everybody that did video was like, hey, wait a minute. That's a matte. Since then, if you look, when Pelosi, when these other people go, either there's like a nondescript scene behind them, or it's static. It's a deduction. Who knows? I'm not being a paranoid psychotic here. I believe that he's in Warsaw for what it's worth. In any event,
the bottom line is, though,
if he knows,
he'll
be assassinated.
He's under the control of other people who can prevent him from sitting down to negotiate and enter the war.
He's an actor. He reads a script. That's his job. He gets paid nice. He's got a condo next to Juan Guaido's, probably in Miami. He's got tens of millions of dollars too. He does. He owns real estate in Miami. He does. That's been disclosed. So
Juan Guaido. That's a name I didn't expect to come up in this conversation.
So anyway, to conclude that, another possibility in essence is if there's an extended war, that it actually creates a change in the political conditions in Europe, where either the EU breaks up, whatever happens. And that, these are the kinds of things that happen in a real world war. Like the real alliances end up forming where the real interests lie.
Yes.
Of a real deep elite. And so, we've got a really fragile one right now where
that's right. And the real interests here are the economic interests.
Yeah.
The long-term economic interests.
I agree. So we got
the
gas deal. Yeah. Like when you're buying gas to fuel your industrial base from this guy, and somebody says you can't, you have to pay 3 times as much to this and do what we tell you. There's a part of the elite.
You have to build special ports for stuff to come in on. It's going to cost billions of dollars.
Right, that's right.
And why? Why not just say, hell with you, I'm going to buy it from this guy?
So there's that kind of stuff. The third is that if there's a limited exchange of nuclear weapons, that there's a global uprising. I'm not relying on that, but humanity has shown itself to be quite adaptable over time, if a little slow at the trigger. And I think, staring at actual annihilation, you might see some remarkable things from our species, and I'm hoping that that's the case.
I guess we can all hope for that. But it seems, in the short run, that the United States, or NATO, let's put it that way, is likely to lose this war.
I think they've already lost. Having it is a loss, I think.
From their point of view, though, having it was not a loss, right? Because they wanted to push Russia, into going into Ukraine.
Yeah.
And so from their point of view, that was a victory. It was a success when they got them to come into Ukraine.
And for Russia, also, you've got you had a situation that was basically a threat in place of full expression of conquest, basically, and so they pushed back before on their own timetable. So
smart.
having interrupted that progression was a victory. And since it was done to prevent a war, they're going to fight the war to its conclusion, with the goal being to, remain in existence. And so as long as they are, they're going to fight. And they have weapons to end it, in a real ugly way that they have said they'll use. And that's the logic of those weapons, is to use it rather than be made extinct. And so
yes,
that's as long as the U.S. is pushing, that's the direction it goes.
Right. So eventually the U.S. has to back down.
The job is for us to make it back down. If we don't do that, we're screwed. That's basically how it works.
Well, we have a lot of things that if we don't do, we're screwed. And what that basically comes down to is we have to change the Congress, and we have to change the executive branch wholesale. Yeah. We have to throw out hundreds of people and start dealing with entirely different people.
Yeah, my personal opinion is that it's even deeper than that, systemic. Right now, though.
But this is actually systemic, because the point is the key position in the system right now is the power of the oligarchs to buy the political decision makers.
Yeah, I agree with
and
that.
To keep them bought.
Yep.
So presumably, if we were to throw out 200 or 300 of those and replace them with people who are not bought for a limited time anyway, the toxic money would be out of politics and would not be calling the tune in the Congress. If it were perceived by people that the problem with the Congress is that everybody is bought, and that if people take money, they're bought, then the new Congress people who would come in would be people who would know that if they start taking that big money, they're going to be kicked out too.
Yeah, that's a systemic solution. You have to establish. Look, it can't hang on the character of the people that are in power. It hangs on the nature of the society that the role of power plays, and also the locus of power. Because if wealth translates into power, then when somebody new comes in, you pay them and they take the job, no matter who they are.
Yes.
Or you say, we pay you, or we shoot you.
Exactly.
We're going to pay him to shoot you.
Exactly.
And so, as long as that power exists to do that, we got a problem. But right now, the immediate problem we have, it may involve a systemic solution, but the immediate problem we have is to force the United States government to stop conducting a war against Russia and to move NATO and the military back to a place where it's not a threat to Russia.
Yes.
And to do the same in China, by the way, because that's developing too.
Yeah, that's developing too. And of course, Taiwan is at the center of that. And I don't think there's any way to keep the Chinese out of Taiwan permanently.
It's theirs.
It's Chinese territory.
It's China.
It's China.
All right. And at that, I got to hit it. I got to move on.
Yes, I know. I'm quite aware of the time. I thank you for staying so long.
Thank you, too. I appreciate it. I enjoyed talking with you, Joe, and I hope to do it again soon.
Great conversation. And I hope this is only the first of many conversations that we'll have, Don.
Yep. Give me a holler. I'm retired. I have time.
Okay, thanks. I will give you a holler.
Okay. Thanks.
Bye.